There is no ugly. There's no bad.
All right. So, without
I'll
further ado,
I'll jump in.
turn it over to you.
Good, thank you very much. My name is Pat McKay, and I've been at the Rochester Hills Museum for 23 years. And it's been really great. Over the years, I've worked with Lorraine very, very closely, and I've passed out, if you don't have one of my museum newsletters, it just came out, it's the January, February, March issue. But in that, recently, last summer, we had an article. Somebody had contacted our museum about a saltwater swimming pool that had once existed in the area. They didn't know what that meant. And I had no idea what they were talking about, but I called Lorraine, and somehow it came out that it was on 20 Mile Road and something. They used some word and some road names that we wouldn't commonly use. And so I called Lorraine, and she, of course, immediately knew about the saltwater pool. And we had all kinds of photographs and a whole lot of background information. So in that, I don't want all those pictures, nor do I want all that archival material. I want the city of Troy to have it, because it was in your community. Even though I'm sure a lot of Rochester kids came down and swam here. We really work hard in that when we work with different communities' archives to kind of make sure we know what our boundaries are and what they're not. So that's my example with the Troy Museum. The other one is next month. Your speaker is Bill McElhone, who's with the Birmingham Museum. Yesterday and today, Bill and I have been working on the Yamasaki architectural firm was based at one point out of Troy, Michigan. They designed the World Trade Towers, but for the many years before they were in Troy, they were in Rochester Hills. And we're concerned that as that company has gone bankrupt, we're trying to make sure all those records have been saved and archived somewhere. And there was a rumor that the archives and scale models of the World Trade Towers that they designed were still in the office building in Rochester. So this morning at 8 o'clock, I was sleuthing through a building, and I finally found the building manager and started asking the same questions. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to track down is if there's still some archival material that's there that we should save somehow on this firm that affected Birmingham, Troy, and Rochester, because it really affects all of our communities. So our three museums really try to work pretty closely together. What I'm going to do tonight is kind of blast through the tops. I'm skimming the surface. If you're a milk person, I'm just skimming the top of all of our history. If you wanted me to talk about the mills, that's a 1-hour event that I have. I can do a whole talk just on the mills that were in Rochester. I can also do a 1-hour talk just on the people, on famous residents of the Rochester Hills area. I can also do a 1 hour on just Stony Creek Village, which is one of our small communities, similar to what Big Beaver or something would have been. We have so we have all these 1-hour presentations, and I'm combining all of them and doing them in less than an hour tonight. So it's almost torturing me when somebody asks me to come and do this program, because there's just so many fun things to talk about. And then I saw your book on the fire department. I've been following that. I've been a firefighter in Rochester Hills for 15 years, and 6 years before that on the Utica Fire Department. So I have 20-some years of experience. And you'll see a couple of my slides. I'll show you some fire slides, and how fire has altered our community's history. And we forced our fire department in Rochester years ago to also print a book on the history of all the fires. And you just start seeing pretty much on how it all affected us. When we talk about our early settlers, and the things that I talk about that happened in Rochester are so similar to what happened not only in southeast Michigan, it really happened in the Midwest. So I can talk in pretty broad terms and pretty broad strokes when we talk about settlement. But our first settlers came from upstate New York, like all the settlers that came from Troy. And in a minute, my next slide, I'm going to tell you why they came here. And I always say the most significant event in Michigan's history didn't happen in Michigan. It happened in New York State. And that's my next slide. But when they came here, they were coming mainly for cheap land. That's what they were looking for. And Michigan was a hard sell. Before Michigan was sold, unlike other states, before Michigan was sold, it was surveyed. And as a part of the Northwest Act, when they were purchasing this, so they divided us into townships, and Troy Township, we were Avon Township. The whole state of Michigan was divided into townships. And the surveyors sent word back that Michigan was pretty much a swampland. And when they came north from Detroit, through these swamps called Southfield and Royal Oak and Ferndale, they were finding chest-deep water, clouds of mosquitoes. It was not pleasant. And the reports back from the Tiffin report, the first land survey, said that if you found 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 acres that was tillable for crops, you would be lucky. And so that's what was trickling back, and that's what pioneers were hearing back in New York State. So they were going around Michigan. They were going to Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Missouri, Wisconsin. They weren't coming here. And so when the Native Americans started talking, saying, well, you haven't found the oak lands north of Detroit then, have you? And for pioneers, they know what oak lands mean. That oak land means that, first of all, oak trees don't grow in the water. They need well-drained soils. And so they had to have water here. They've had oak trees, you have acorns. If you have acorns, you have deer, and you have squirrel, and you have bear, and you could hunt. You've got good wood to build log cabins. And so and that's what happened. They finally came around. They didn't come north from Detroit. They went to Mount Clemens, Michigan, and they followed the Clinton River inland. So that's how they came to our area, the Troy, Rochester area. So water became really a crucial link in our transportation and attracting people to this area. And so at that time, the U.S. government, realizing that the $2.50 an acre was exorbitant and nobody could afford it, they dropped the price of land to $1.25 an acre. And you had to buy 80 acres at a time. So if you do that math quick, it's $100. And imagine $100. And then when do they come? Well, most of our pioneers would have arrived in March or April. And so the ground is bad. You know, they're trying to get here. The transportation routes were not very dependable. The roads were terrible. Hey, wait a minute. That's what we're saying nowadays. You know, they had to arrive in March or April. And then what they were bringing with them was everything they could fit into a covered wagon and enough food to last that first harvest. So that first harvest, when they got here in April and May, they had to get to work. They had to clear land. They had to get planted with the idea that they have to harvest that. That's the food that's going to get them through that first winter. The food they brought with them was going to get them to the fall. And then they had to have that first harvest. If that first harvest would fail, they were in big trouble. There was a good chance they weren't going to survive that first year in the wilderness of Michigan. So that became a crucial part of these families. So you start understanding what stress is. You know, so our family that settled our area, last name was Taylor. They sent their son Elisha Taylor in the spring of 1822. He had come overland, and by 1823 he brought the whole family. 60 people came to Stony Creek Village, and that was right about the same time. 1817 is when some of the Revolutionary War soldiers were actually landing in the Rochester area, so the Graham family. The typical log cabin sketch you'll see on the left, this is our last log cabin in our community that was located on Tinkin Road, right in Stony Creek Village where our museum is located. That was torn down in the 1940s, so it lasted quite a long time. And then a significant event was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was an amazing highway, 363 miles long. That's from here to Mackinac Bridge. I mean, it's at least as far from here to Mackinac Bridge. Hand dug. I mean, no machinery, dug with no manpower, mules, oxen, and so they carved this canal, this highway, from the Hudson River all the way through a very populated upstate New York, and they got into the Great Lakes. And so then once again, shipping then kind of takes over. So then on the Great Lakes then, suddenly they had to improve the ships there, and they went from sail ships to steamships. Walk in the water was probably the most popular one. And then all those ports on the Great Lakes, Cleveland, Detroit, Toledo, Chicago, Mackinac, all become wide open. And there's this floodgate of immigrants that are finally coming here. The other thing is, and it's my newsletter, all this perfect timing here, is I have a story in our newsletter based on a story I found last summer while I was traveling in New Hampshire. They talked about what happened in the summer of 1816 on the east coast of the United States. In the summer of 1816, there had been 3 volcanic eruptions in the Far East, in Indonesia and in Indonesia, Philippines, 2 in Indonesia, 1 in the Philippines. And so these earthquakes had happened, and so what happened in the summer of 1816 is that there was the year without a summer. They said they had ice on the ponds on the 4th of July. And so all the crops failed on the east coast of the United States and all of Europe. The crops failed. So starvation was kind of a big deal. I mean, prices of all commodities went up. And so in 1817, the next year, was this mass migration out of the east coast. So here's our new little tidbit that we've just learned. I was sharing with Nancy is that, part of our settlement is based on, and the reason why we're all living in southeastern Michigan is based on a couple of volcanic eruptions in the Philippines. Imagine that. And all these sequence of events, and that's what history is so much fun, is you realize all these series of events that happened that kind of forced pioneers to finally make their way here. You'll see that in my newsletter, so you can check that out. So the Erie Canal is opened. If you follow the Erie Canal through upstate New York, it goes through all these towns. I've never heard of them before. Farmington, Troy, Utica, Rochester. And for most of those people, imagine they're coming here, and they're not going back. They have a one-way ticket. They don't have enough money to go back. They have to make this work. And so when they're landing here, they're leaving a nice house, kind of like the Caswell house here. It's the sawmills were running, you had wood floors, you had carpeting, you had a piano, you had all these luxuries of home. Well, you didn't fit all that on your covered wagon. You came with the bare necessities. You were basically coming to camp in Michigan is what you were doing. And so they didn't bring any of that. And so there was homesickness. There was depression, and so they named towns after towns they were familiar with. It gave them a little sense of home, and that's how, Troy and Rochester, certainly in Utica, those are the towns you're a little more familiar with. They also brought what was called canal fever with them. Canals worked. They were economic successes. And so what do you do in Michigan in 1817? We're a brand new state. 1837, we finally have enough people to become a state. It's a big deal. So what do when you have to elect your first governor? You elect the best person you can find. And it's a 21-year-old guy named Stephen T. Mason. Imagine that, electing a 21-year-old to run your state. And that's what happened in Michigan. The first thing he did was to start an internal road improvement project. He said, the roads in Michigan are terrible. And so they started an internal improvement, and the first thing they wanted to do was dig a canal. And they wanted to dig that canal across the base of Michigan, a shortcut from Detroit, Mount Clemens, basically, all the way to Chicago. And they were going to connect the Clinton River, which spills into Lake St. Clair, with the Kalamazoo River that spills into Lake Michigan. They were just going to connect these two. Now, it sounds like it's difficult, but canals were the way to go. George Washington was a huge proponent of canals. And he had great influence on what was going on with the Erie Canal. He was certainly encouraging all this. And so they were going to connect the Kalamazoo River, the Clinton River, and do this. So they started that. And you'll see in my picture here, that's the aqueduct that once was in Rochester Hills, right by Yates Cider Mill. At Yates Cider Mill, with the aqueduct, that's actually Clinton River water crossing over top of the Clinton River. And so Ripley's, believe it or not, covered in Rochester that the only river in the world that crosses over top of itself is in Rochester, Michigan, artificially done. But this was a way of bringing these canal boats. And now, how successful was it? Well, the Erie Canal was about $7 million to go 363 miles. They had that paid off in 3 years. So it was a marvelous success, and it's still there today. So they've really gotten their money out of that project. The Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal wasn't quite as successful. It got 16 miles, and then it went bankrupt. 1837 was also not only the year Michigan became a state, it was the first year the United States had their first major depression economically. And so all the banks that had loaned money, boy, here we are back to that same topic. All the banks failed. There were a lot of wildcat banks with no capital behind them. And then the railroad was coming too, and the railroad was a lot easier to put rails on top of the ground than digging a canal through the forest of Michigan. If you follow this, the canal, I have for years been following how this happened. I have no evidence that they were digging on the Lake Michigan side coming our direction. I would have thought that maybe you kind of all meet in the middle at some point. There's no evidence that they knew that this canal was coming, so I always kind of concerned me a little bit. And if you follow the Kalamazoo River, it ended in this very glamorous town called Singapore, Michigan. Now, Singapore, Michigan certainly has that European flavor to it. It sounds sophisticated and all that. Singapore, Michigan isn't there anymore. It got buried by sand dunes, and no buildings exist anymore. The town that rose up in this place is Saugatuck, Michigan. And so it's still there. That's where the Kalamazoo River comes out. So they got as far as 16 miles into Rochester, went bankrupt, and that's as far as they went. So there's three things that happened. I feel like a real estate agent when I say the most significant thing that happened in Rochester's history is that we have water, and we have water. We have Paint Creek, Stony Creek, and the Clinton River. And for pioneers, they were looking for industry and ways of enhancing what they could do. The three things they worried about every morning, same things I worry about every morning when I wake up: food, clothing, and shelter. And they had a mill to take care of each of those needs. For food, they had a grist mill. For clothing, they had a woolen mill. For shelter, they had the sawmills. On the big scheme of things, sawmills don't last very long. It's just the economics of what would happen. You go out, you cut down all the trees, and I always imagine this. At some point, you go outside and you look around and you say, hey, where are all those trees? You got a sawmill, and there's no trees left because you cut them down. Sawmills last 5 to 7 years, and then they're gone. Or then the need for them is gone. So then you have to switch that sawmill to something else. You start adaptively reusing it, which is historic preservationists love to talk about reusing buildings rather than throwing them away into a landfill. They'll find another use for them. Such as the building we're in right now. This is a great adaptive reuse. And so that's what happened. The Yates Cider Mill in our town is a classic example, built as a sawmill. We know it today as a cider mill here. You'll start seeing where some of these mills were all located here. We basically have Paint Creek coming down, Stony Creek coming down, and the Clinton River bisects our community east to west. And so the congregation of where all these mills are located is right in downtown Rochester. So downtown Rochester really had a lot going for it, because we had water. And so that's the first thing I'll talk about, why Rochester was settled where it is. Now, these three rivers don't come together at one point, but pretty darn close to one point. Within a mile of each other, all these things are coming. In fact, a couple of the mills that were actually able to build a tail race that came off of the Clinton River and off of Paint Creek to power their mills. That's a pretty remarkable power source. There was no other power. There was no electricity, there's no geothermal, there's no wind, there's no solar. That didn't exist. Water power was the only way you could power a mill. By having a mill, you had industry. By having industry, you had more people moving in. So then you could build churches and blacksmith shops and all those other things that go with it. So mills became really a significant part of our history. I'm going to blast through just a couple of our local mills. One of them I like to talk about, the Rochester Mill, is the first one up here. Now in this building, it really appears to be a brick structure. It was not. It was a wooden structure. And like most buildings that I talk about that are very old in the Rochester area, it burned to the ground. Very common. It's just highly combustible. In the background, you see how significant the train must have been. That train track and bridge is still standing. They're actually rebuilding that bridge right now. So the Rochester Mill lasted from the early 1800s, 1840s, and then it burned to the ground in the 1880s, and then it was rebuilt. At that point, the Rochester Woolen Mill, and it was called the Western Knitting Mill also, moved from downtown Detroit, moved out to Rochester, Michigan, because of the great power source they had out there with the Paint Creek. And so they brought it out here and started running, and that's the mill located in the lower right-hand corner. At one point, it was the largest knitting mill in the world. It was located in Rochester, Michigan. A couple of things happened with that. One is they didn't have enough employees living in Rochester to run it. They were looking for people. So you start seeing, in my next slide, I'll show you these. You know, and usually when you see a full-page ad that says, "We want girls," it's not always a good ad. You know, you don't look at it, but that's exactly what they really had working in this mill. In the lower corner, you see the pictures of all the students and the kids. I don't know if they're working in the mill. I don't know about child labor laws. You know, you want to believe that we were a squeaky clean community and that didn't happen. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, whether that's kids or the employees. Stacked up in all these bundles are gloves. And talking to some of my 92-year-old volunteers, they remember sewing the thumbs on the gloves. During World War II, during World War I, they were a manufacturer of khaki uniforms for the soldiers, the American soldiers. It closed down during the Great Depression, but they had to open it up again because they had to start making scarves and mittens and all that for the CCC program. So it was the largest producer, you know, for all those CCCs in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota who needed warm clothes. They went back to production. So that helped our community in 1929. And then by World War II, they converted it over to making photo flash bombs. So photo flash bombs are a flare that's made out of magnesium, and it would be fired into the sky with a cannon. And then it would, a silk parachute, it would help it float to the ground. And as it floated, it burned so brightly that you could do photography with it. So that's a pretty bright flare. The Navy used them substantially, as the Air Force did too, mainly over the ocean. And they would be able to look for periscopes or enemy troops or anything like that. So it was the largest producer in the United States of photo flash bombs. They tested them in another area near our downtown area. There were terrible explosions. They didn't always go well. And most of the employees working at this mill were women at that time. The men were gone off after the war, and these explosions always claimed women's lives. And so we have some terrible, terrible pictures of the explosions and the devastation that had happened there. The building's still there today. Now it's called the Rochester Mills Beer Company. It's one of many businesses in there. They also had to build these dormitories on the upper right-hand corner. The local priest, in fact, I missed that point in my last slide. At one point, they didn't have enough workers, and so the owners of the mill went to Royal Oak, Michigan, and said, "Listen, we don't have a Catholic church in our area, and if you would come here and start a Catholic church, then we could attract Catholics to move to Rochester." So they did, and they started St. Andrew's Catholic Church, which is now kind of one of about 5 different Catholic churches that we have in the Rochester area. But suddenly, this mill is responsible for the Catholic Church. And you start seeing this, how one thing kind of affects the other. They also, one of the local ministers, Reverend Callicott, who is our Methodist minister, was from Calumet, Michigan. He recognized from Calumet, Michigan, there's a lot of unemployed miners. You know, the copper mines at that point were shutting down, so he went up there and encouraged people to move to Rochester. So suddenly we had this ethnic group of Finnish and different Cornish that were moving to Rochester, bringing those traditions with them and to work in the mill. And they built these dormitories on the south side of the building. The dormitories are not there, but the mill itself is still there. And so it's still an operating venture here. The other thing that we had, we're certainly with the mills. We talked about Yates Cider Mill. Yates Cider Mill is a mill that a lot of people are familiar with. It's still operating. Of the 32 mills that I indicated that were located in Rochester, we have 2 left. One of them is Yates Cider Mill. The other one is the Western Knitting Mill that I just showed you pictures of. Yates started off as a sawmill and then eventually converted over to producing cider. Now, here's how I look at it. Now, that knitting mill, Let's talk about the knitting mill. The knitting mill needed sheep, and sheep aren't running in the wilderness of Michigan, so they have to bring the sheep with them. Remember, you're coming on a covered wagon on the Erie Canal, and you're bringing 40 to 50 sheep with you on this little journey. Imagine how much fun that must have been. And so they did. They arrived in Detroit, and then they went up, probably Gratiot towards Mount Clemens, and then followed the Clinton River inland. And that's where they found Rochester with all these rivers coming together. And so they built these pens. They said that the walls were 10 feet high, and in 2 nights, all the sheep were killed by wolves, roving packs of wolves. So imagine that. That's where we live today. We had packs of wolves. It wasn't safe. We didn't go outside unless we were armed to protect ourselves. And so certainly a risk. So why in the world then are they squeezing apples for cider? Well, you just think, isn't there something a little higher priority-wise that you'd be worried about when wolves are actually attacking and killing? And what about the children and the families and all that? And it was just the opposite. Cider was a crucial link for all pioneers. We want to believe that the water was crystal clear and you could go up and scoop it up with a dipper and drink right out of it. This probably never was the case, just with animals there and then with domestic animals. Especially, those waterways became polluted, just from that. And, any amount of bacteria in there would cause sickness in the pioneers. And so they needed something else to drink besides water. So cider became a crucial link, not just for drinking, but also as a cooking liquid. The food was very bland. It had no spices. So it added some flavor to food, especially when your food may have been spoiled and you were eating it anyways because you didn't have any other choice. Your deep freezer wasn't working that day. And that deer that you killed and had to make last for a week, that food wasn't lasting quite as long as you wanted. You didn't have salt to preserve it. And so a cooking liquid like cider would have helped out with that. So suddenly a cider mill becomes a pretty important economic link, I think, in any community. Other things, we talk about a sawmill. Imagine who's getting the worst end of this deal here, the guy in the top or the guy in the bottom. Well, guess where all the sawdust is falling? It's falling on the guy in the bottom. His job would be called, my job is the pits. You've heard that old-fashioned phrase. Not a good job if you're on the bottom. But if you have a sawmill, suddenly you can cut that board 5 times faster. You're cutting it 5 times, that board's gone, and the next one's coming in. So water power just doubled, tripled, quadrupled our work effort. From weaving, making a blanket a day or a blanket a week, you can make 10 blankets a day and 10 blankets a week. Everything just happened so much quicker and so much faster. It became very, very essential, I think, for the mills. The other one I talk about is the paper mill. The oldest paper mill in the state of Michigan was located in Rochester. It actually started in the 1830s and lasted until about 5 years ago. And they finally just tore that building down. It was underneath our bridge as you come down into Rochester. Many efforts made at trying to save this thing and encourage an adaptive reuse like we see that works very successfully and unfortunately was not successful. My question always is, so what happens to the mills? A lot of them were adaptively reused and could be used, but they didn't all work that way. That's my next slide. I'll talk about the sugar mill. Look at this one here. This is a massive building, certainly one of the biggest buildings. I look at this one, and this is the Detroit Sugar Mill. They also moved from Detroit. In 1899, they built this building, and 6 years later, they tore the whole thing down. Imagine that. What happened there? Where's the business plan? Where did it fail? In every brick factory around. So if there were brick factories in Troy, they were making bricks for this building. And it must have been a huge economic success to bring it up. The waterway you see there is called Paint Creek that runs through our town. And so what happened here? Built in 1901, demolished in 1906. You see in our cartoon sketch there where they're saying you can grow 600-pound sugar beets in Rochester, Michigan. Well, you can't really. The sugar beet capital of Michigan is up in the thumb of Michigan, Carroll, Michigan, Vassar, Michigan. That's where you get the great sugar beets. The soil is a little bit different up there. And what happened, the owners of the mill, of course, encouraged all the farmers to grow beyond your corn, wheat, barley, and alfalfa, start growing sugar beets too. And so they did. They did that in mass quantities. And what would happen, they'd bring those sugar beets to market in the fall, and they would wait in line. The sugar beets would be tested for their sugar content. I don't know how you do that, but somebody did it. And the farmers would wait in line for 3 days. Farmers don't like waiting in line for 3 days when they have crops back on their field, and it took 1 or 2 growing seasons that the farmer said, we're not doing it anymore. And they were treated so poorly by the mill. The mill was taken down, the equipment was shipped to Madison, Wisconsin, and the history of the Detroit Sugar Mill was over. So what do you do with all these bricks? That's a heck of a lot of bricks. Well, there's a couple things you can do. One of them, I'll tell you what happened to the mills. The big sugar mill was recycled. Also, 1875, a local woman Some of the headlines of the 1870s is not a whole lot different than the headlines we see today. So if you ever feel really depressed about what goes on in the newspapers all the time, it's okay. It's been going on for a long time. A local woman had an argument with the owner, and she went in and set the paper mill on fire. Not hard in a paper mill. The place was covered with paper. The other one, the sugar mill, the red bricks were recycled into buildings throughout downtown Rochester. We have a whole lot of red brick buildings built in 1908. The mill was torn down in 1907. We have a lot of red brick buildings built in 1908. They recycled them and reused them throughout. We have two villages in the Rochester area. Rochester, I'm saying Avon Township. Avon Township is very similar to what Troy Township would have been before we both became cities. Pretty much a 36 square mile area, with townships with sections, is broken into 36 sections, 6 square miles. Very similar. And within that, we had two different communities. One was called Rochester, and one was called Stony Creek. It's got to be similar to what's going on in Troy. I'm sure Nancy will answer this question for me. Or you would have had Troy Corners, and then Big Beaver may have been a separate community within, kind of with its own identity. In Rochester, we actually had a couple. Avondale kind of became a separate area. Brooklands was an area in Rochester. Stony Creek and Rochester all would have been communities within Avon Township. In 1985, our community voted to change its form of government from a township to a city. Troy went easy because they went from Troy Township to Troy. We went Avon Township to Rochester Hills. So, not that it ever gets confusing with the city of Rochester. It does a few times. On this map, if you look, this is an 1896 map. And all those little tiny squares you'll see there indicate where a residence was located. So a pretty sparsely populated community at that point. Yet where Rochester is and where Stony Creek is just shaded. And that means that there were so many houses in there, they couldn't even draw them all in there. So it was a very rural area outside of those little village areas. And we're going to kind of explore them both right now. Downtown Rochester has that typical look. And you see storefronts, you see a lot of businesses. In this one lower picture, you get to see the inner urban. I'm going to talk about the inner urban a little bit because that inner urban line connected us. We were connected to Troy and Birmingham and Royal Oak. We traded back and forth, and our communities were very, very interlinked together. And you can see those. That's a kind of a typical business. In the upper right-hand corner, it's kind of hard to see all the chickens and the hogs hanging in the window. I'm sure you went and you picked up your meat fresh every day, and things we don't quite see today. Stony Creek was very similar in the same way. We had roads coming in from 5 different directions and water. Once again, it's always about water in our area. That was Stony Creek that came through. Now, Stony Creek was dammed up 5 times in 1 mile, and they built 5 different mills. So that's a lot of drop. The river dropped about 60 feet in less than a 2-mile span. So they could dam it up and get away with it and keep building another mill. So we had those mills that took care of food, clothing, and shelter. And so suddenly there was a sawmill there, and then there was a church. The Baptist church was located there. The post office was located there, general store, a tavern. All these incredible things that made up a little community were located there. The first Masonic temple in the state of Michigan was located in Stony Creek, Michigan. It was, at one point, Lodge number 1. Today it's Lodge number 5. That's a whole 1-hour history on just the Masons and how that, the dark days of Masonry when they secretly met in one place in Michigan is one of our houses. Fortunately, one of my staff owns that house, so I can get in there whenever I need to. But you'll see that they built a temple up on the top of the building, an octagonal building. It's very well documented. What you do when you work at a museum is you encourage organizations to write the history of their organization, so the museum staff doesn't have to do it all, because it's really hard to do that. The building that I'm showing here on the upper left is the building where they met secretly, the Masons did. Now, the Masons, when they moved here, in our local cemeteries, I'm not sure about Troy and Birmingham, but a lot of the male tombstones in our area have that Masonic emblem engraved on the top. That tells me it's pretty significant if you're going to put that on your tombstone. So it was a big deal. George Washington was a Mason. I refer a lot of things back to these pioneering days. They even say the Revolutionary War, they call it a Masonic convention because you had Masons in England and Masons in the United States. Frequently they'd be on the battlefield and they wouldn't fight because they're all Masons. They wouldn't fight their brothers. Some of our pioneer buildings, all are still existing. Our 1-room schoolhouse is actually now a 2-room schoolhouse. In 1945, this World War II thing finally ended. And by 1950, we had so many kindergartners in our area. I can't quite figure out what happened in those 5 years. The baby boom had happened, and so they put an addition onto that building. So it's actually a 2-room schoolhouse. It's still owned and operated by our local community school system. So Stony Creek and Rochester were kind of our thriving little communities there. Transportation, I'm just going to kind of move through these. It would have been similar to anywhere else. You would have had corduroy roads and you would have plank roads. A corduroy road is a road where you take the round trees and you just nail them side by side by side. Well, imagine what that ride would have been like. Mark Twain talks about it, how his teeth would just rattle out of his head. He said it was the worst. It'd be easier to walk alongside than to try and go down that road. Now, this is not a Rochester scene. On the other side, though, you start seeing this plank road. Now, that looks a lot like it'd be a lot smoother. You know, they're cutting the planks, and it would be smooth for about 2.5 weeks. And then those boards would start doing just similar to what that board is. They would start warping so badly that even that was not a very good thing. Now, did we have those there? Absolutely. And you would have had plank roads coming right down Livernois and right down Rochester Road. In fact, the Royal Oak and Rochester Plank Road Company, the date on that is 1850, and they didn't fill in the end there, but those are the tolls. And tolls would have been based on how many, most likely how many oxen were pulling your cart. In 1850, we would have had a lot more oxen than we had horses here. Oxen were a lot stronger. They could handle the mud a lot better. They had a clove foot so they could go through the mud easier. Horses have hooves with suction cups, and they had trouble, you know, until the roads got better and the fields were first plowed. You would have had a lot more oxen here. And so that became very significant. And then what happened in Rochester was the luckiest thing ever, was the railroad came. And the railroad is what changed Rochester more than anything. And it lasted 90 years. It's really a short lifespan when it comes to railroads. In 1872, the first railroad came. It was called the Detroit and Bay City Railroad. I like that name because it tells me exactly where it went. It went from Detroit to Bay City. Not a very creative name, but so it went up from the thumb of Michigan, you know, kind of up the tip, down to downtown Detroit, a huge population center at that point in 1872. And so it came through Rochester, Michigan. It followed the grade of the Paint Creek. You know, trains can't go up these big steep hills. They need a constant grade, and rivers kind of have a constant grade. The Paint Creek is a nice drop there. And then in 1879, another train came. And that train went from the tip of the thumb of Michigan up Port Huron area to Chicago. So those two train tracks crisscrossed. And they crisscrossed in downtown Rochester. So we had 30 trains a day were coming through town. 6 of them were passenger trains. They need hotels. And when we look at our business, what happened in 1871, we had about 22 businesses in downtown Rochester. In 1872, we had 54 businesses. So things doubled. I mean, overnight, in 1 year, they doubled. The other little things that you don't think about, time. You know, how do you tell the time? I don't know how pioneers did it. But when the trains came, you had to start getting some kind of standardized thing. So we found this article in one of our newspapers. It says, "What time is it, stranger? 2:30. Standard or local?" This is often heard. Now, as the railroads use standard time, why don't our village dads name Central Standard Time as the official time and thereby have the same time through the length and breadth of our city? So obviously, the time on the north side of town and the time on the south side of town could be off by quite a bit. And so I don't know how anybody ever got to church on time or to any meeting, because nobody had a watch and everything was based on what time you thought it was. And so we did have watchmakers right on Main Street, and we have funny stories about that. But nonetheless, we had 2 train depots then, and so we were really lucky. We had these 30 trains a day coming. That's not the same thing as the interurban line, which brought more trains, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So the railroad became significant. So what happened to the trains? Well, we still kind of have the routes there. One of the routes is called the Paint Creek Trail, and the other route is called the Clinton River Trail. They've both been turned into Rails to Trails projects, so we got bike riders and hikers and cross-country skiers using it. 1964 was the last time you could hop on a train. Now, you can still do that in Birmingham, right? You can still jump on an Amtrak and do that. And then in 1971, underneath our South Hill Bridge, the big bridge leading into downtown Rochester, the train jumped the tracks at the depot and went through the depot. So that depot isn't there anymore. The other depot is still being used as a gift shop right next to our post office. So certainly a significant part of our history. So, but not long lasting. So, you know, came in 1872, gone by 1964. So not even a 100-year time span. And then we have the interurban line, even a shorter time span. Arrives in Rochester about 1900. By 1930, it's gone. But a phenomenal transportation system. When it opened, of course, in 1900, Detroit was the #1 mass transit community in the world, and the #1 urban area. We had the best mass transit system in the world. Now we're known as the only urban area that doesn't have a mass transit system. And so what a phenomenal flip. And it's that automobile has really done it to us, you know? It's the best and the worst of what's happened to the town. What the interurban line did was tie the the populated areas of Detroit with all these rural communities like Troy and Rochester and Oxford and Romeo. Because what happened in Rochester, it came up Livernois, it's right past your museum here. In fact, I think that church, that's a barn, the barn-shaped church, is an interurban stop there. And so it came, and I know we've done some programs with the Troy Museum. That interurban would come up to Livernois, coming out of Royal Oak, went up Livernois to South Boulevard. It took a sharp right turn, sharp enough that that's where all the rollover accidents happened right there. Turned right on South Boulevard, went to Rochester Road, and then went north. Now, just north of downtown Rochester, it branched. And so that's a good thing, because then you got cars coming from two directions into your community. One branch went up Orion Road all the way to Flint. That was kind of the terminus up there. The other one went down Tinkin Road to Romeo, and then Imlay City was the end that way. And so these lines all fed into downtown Rochester, and they all came right down Livernois through Troy and then to Royal Oak and Clawson, and kind of hooked us all together. And so Rochester had 60 trains a day. So I'm guessing you had the same thing. You had 60-some trains a day going up and down here. Imagine that. So we had 60 interurban cars and then 30 trains a day. So 90 trains a day. And today we don't have train tracks. I mean, imagine that. So by 1930, 1933, the interurban's gone. You know, what happens to it? Well, a couple of things happened. Franchise agreements had to be negotiated with every single individual community, and so they'd have to get permission to raise their rates. And of course, nobody would say, we don't want you to raise your rates, we want to keep them cheap so people can travel back and forth. And then we all bought an automobile. You know, we loved the freedom of that. And so by 1930, the whole system was bankrupt and didn't last anymore. In downtown Rochester, we had pictures like this. Now, my archival picture, what it doesn't show is that spaghetti of overhead power lines that must have been terribly unsightly. You know, and from our judgment today, that's what I would say. It would have looked awful. And yet, I'm sure it was great signs of progress. It also meant you had electricity that you could pull into your house. And so, because we had the power plant and the maintenance barns were all located in downtown Rochester. They burned to the ground in the 1930s. But yeah, you can kind of see some of the telephone poles. You can't quite see all the cables. They've washed out a little bit. And then downtown, we had a big, long wooden trestle, one of the longest trestles, and in fact, replaced with the longest concrete bridge in the state of Michigan to span that valley. And the reason why that bridge is there is for that interurban. The interurban couldn't make it up the hill, so they had to span that valley. And what you forget is that Rochester's in a low area. And when we talk about our geographical points, you forget that we have a North Hill, an area by Tinkin called North Hill, and then on the other side by Leader Dogs to the Blind called South Hill. And so Rochester's kind of at the bottom of this valley where all these rivers kind of connect. And so we're in the bottom of a valley. So they had to build bridges to kind of span these valleys so not only the interurban, but the automobiles could make it up the hills. The first Model Ts couldn't make it up South Hill either. So they had to figure out ways of, they would go up so straight that all the gas would rush to the back of the tank, and so the cars would stall out. And so they would frequently have to go back down, turn the car, and then reverse, go up the hills. And it was all gravity-feed fuel systems. And so it had nothing to do with gears or anything, just had to do with gas tanks were mounted on the cars initially. I think the big barrels you see here are probably in case it catches on fire. And we have a lot of residents that did oral histories and said they were so scared to death when this thing first came into town. There was no way they were going on that car across that bridge. And so they got off, and they walked along the side, and they got back on the car after that car crossed the thing. There was no way they were going on that. Locally, we all would have had farms, lots of farms, a lot of family farms. Mom and dad, their local family are growing the crops that they need. In Rochester, we had 5 corporate farms, and these were major operations and major employers in our area. I'm going to make sure I counted. I think I got it right. I'm going to show one picture of each of these. Ferrymore Seed Farm, Great Oaks, Van Hoosen, Meadowbrook, Park Davis. None of them were competing with each other. None of them were competition. All very different. Ferrymore was a seed farm. Great Oaks, stock. Van Hoosen was all about dairy. Meadowbrook did horses. And Park Davis was a biological farm. They raised animals so they could do experiments on them. So I don't want to get into the animal rights thing. I'm just a history guy. I just tell you the way it was. 2 of my pictures that I show here are pictures from the Ferrymore Seed Farm. Some phenomenal science that was going on there. The Ferrymore Seed Company started out of Detroit, and at some point as they were growing their crops, and these are the same little packets that you buy your seeds in to plant your own gardens. You can still do that to this day. But at some point they needed farms to grow these seeds, to grow the plants that you could harvest the seeds from. And as Detroit got bigger, those gardens, that land became more valuable, so they needed a place outside of Detroit where they could buy cheap land, and they had to have great transportation. We had the interurban line that went from Rochester to Detroit. So it was a perfect situation. So they came out and they bought a square mile. Today our Target is located there, and all our doctor's offices are right smack dab on the middle of it. And in fact, the big drying barn was only torn down about 1988, so not, in the big scheme of history, in the last 20 years, the dryer barn finally went down. But they grew plants for seeds. The local workers that would have worked there, their kids would have all gone to Hamlin Elementary School, which is located right near there. The workers, the kids would say, and the stories that we were told is that at harvest time, the workers would be able to take their muskmelon and watermelon, and they'd take them to their kids. And they had these big piles of fruits and vegetables. The kids could eat all they wanted. Well, it was just a treat for a kid to have all this, delicious. And, as you all know, a Michigan cantaloupe and muskmelon is better than any other cantaloupe you can get. So, nonetheless, these kids were eating it. But the whole time they ate this, the superintendent of the Ferrymore Seed Farm would be standing over top of them, glowering down at them, and making sure that they were spitting the seeds out as they were eating those. They needed those seeds. So the kids could eat it, but they had to spit the seeds out. They wanted those watermelon seeds. Those were washed, packaged, and shipped all over the world. And so they said it was so hard to enjoy it when you had this guy watching you, making sure you were spitting out the seeds the whole time you were doing it. We do have, in one of our historic districts, some of the small houses are still there that were where the most trusted workers had a chance to live and to be on the farm. And then we have one barn left of all this huge complex, just a massive complex of buildings. On the Hampton Golf Course, they have used one of the buildings. Very little evidence really left of that. Great Oaks started off as this huge wood called Wood Dawn, 1897. They had a huge octagonal building. That disappeared. Eventually, the family moved into what was known as the Great Oaks. It was the country club. It was their headquarters. They eventually tore down that family's home and then built a much larger one there. But Howard McGregor owned Great Oak Stock Farm. He was one of our largest business owners. He owned a company called Twist Drill, which is located on the north side of town, and was very involved. And this is where it's fun to start talking about these stories. He was one of many philanthropists that lived in the Rochester area. And as as the needs of Rochester changed and we needed a hospital, he was the first chairman of the board at Crittenden Hospital as they changed the name from Bertha Van Hoosen Hospital, which is the name I wanted. This is way before my time. But they created Crittenden Hospital. He was the chairman of the board. He donated the land so they could build Crittenden Hospital as part of his farm. One of the farm buildings is still standing right there, and it's used for something else with the hospital. But then he also donated the land to build North Hill Elementary, McGregor Elementary, which is named after him, and then the Great Oaks Golf Course is built on their farmland. Very green grass all the time. I can't figure out why their grass is so green on a stock farm. I'm sure it's a well-fertilized area. So the McGregors, so he was a businessman who I guess what I would consider a gentleman farmer on the side. He raised Angus beef cattle. The Van Hoosen farm is where I get to go to work all the time. And I talk about this remarkable family that lived there for 5 generations. Each of the families, they bought this land in 1823 from the U.S. government, and it's never been sold since then. That's kind of a remarkable story. Each family kind of carefully handed it to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, who gave it to the last one, who was Sarah Van Hoosen Jones, who had a master's degree in animal husbandry and a PhD in animal genetics. A woman doing this, which is unheard of. And then Sarah, an only child who had never married, handed it to Michigan State University, who handed it to the city of Rochester Hills. And so it's not that anybody doesn't want it, it's just that it's been very carefully protected. And that's really part of our story. You can see some of these great pictures. Sarah Van Hoosen's grandfather, Joshua, headed to the California Gold Rush. So that's a whole neat story to bring in, talk about how he got to California, how he got back. But he came back with gold in his pocket. One as an enticement to finally get Sarah Taylor to marry him, for crying out loud. The stories that we were told about the two of them and this romance that went back and forth through letters was he said, "I will come back home if you will marry me." And she said, "I haven't found anyone else yet." And as a guy, I'm not sure how I would interpret that exactly, but he came home. And one of the other letters was from another young man in Stony Creek Village, and he said, "Joshua, we see your brown-eyed girl has a piece of California gold on her finger." Sounds like an engagement ring to me. He came home then and built this big barn, the big barn on the top and to the right. He had built it to be 101 feet long. Lysander Woodward had a barn in Rochester on our corner, a mile away, 100 feet long, the longest in Oakland County. Joshua built his 101 feet long, the longest in Oakland County. And then the lower one shows one of our buildings. That's where our main dairy barn is that we've converted now into exhibit space and our archival area and stuff like that. So what do we talk about with the Van Hoosen family? Well, when we talk about Sarah, we also talk about her aunt, who's a very famous surgeon who traveled internationally. But it was the first farm to experiment with this new thing called silos. We start preserving food so that year-round the food tastes the same to the cows so that the milk tastes the same. First one to try. The longest barn in Oakland County, first use of concrete on floors so they could start creating sterile conditions. Milk was having issues because the bacteria in milk was eventually spoiling before it could get to market. People were getting sick from milk, so they experimented with concrete floors. Certified milk meant that it was both produced and bottled on the same farm. First farm to try that and experiment with it. And then the first woman master farmer in the state of Michigan was Dr. Sarah Van Hoosen Jones. You see a picture of her here, very masculine-looking woman in our pictures. She worked with men. She worked with cattle all day, and the whispers about her in town always was that she wore pants. She didn't wear dresses. She wore pants. It was at a time when women didn't wear pants. Women wore dresses, and so we hear these whispers, and all those things that I think that we've become very sensitive about how you treat different ethnic groups and all that. It was happening to women, and it was happening for centuries. And so what happens to our buildings? You have the biggest barn burned to the ground on Palm Sunday, 1967. Caught the attached barn on fire too, so those have all burned. Our largest buildings in our site are gone due to fire. And then we restored the dairy barn off the side. So fire, and who came to help us? The Troy Fire Department, thank you very much. And all of our major fires, and every one, they always refer to the Troy Fire Department, over and over and over again. You always called Troy. So once in a while Pontiac would come, but Troy would always be the first one. The other big farm that we had here, we had a guy named John Dodge, and John Dodge and his brother Horace, remarkable inventors, and they were living in Detroit. And at some point, as transportation allowed them to get outside, like the interurban line, they started buying these estates out in the country. We were the country, okay? I'm filling this in. Troy and Rochester were out in the country. And so this is one of them, and that's the John Dodge Farmhouse. That's what they call it. That's the original building in 1897. And then Oakland University still uses that as part of their alumni relations, so that's still there. But then John Dodge died. He died in the flu epidemic of 1918. His brother died in January. He died in October. They caught it at the auto show in New York City. And so the flu epidemic is really, with the H1N1 kind of being a concern out there now, they keep talking about pandemics and epidemics. The influenza epidemic of 1918 is really the last one that we had where millions and millions and millions of people died worldwide. Certainly affected us locally here. When he died, he had married a woman, Matilda, and Matilda became the wealthiest woman in the world at that point. And then she married a lumber baron. So you can kind of see what happened. Her wealth really skyrocketed. And so her and her husband, Alfred, decided to build this little shack out in Rochester called Meadowbrook Hall, the third largest house in the United States, 88,000 square feet. It's really one of those remarkable houses. And, all I can say is encourage anyone to go on a tour. It's just really one of the most remarkable architectural things that we, features that we have, not only in the Rochester area, but in the United States. It's really a remarkable home. But she raised horses on that farm, and it was really, just a spectacular farm. Let's talk about philanthropists. At the end of her life, she donated it to Michigan State University, or to the state of Michigan, through Michigan State University, and they created Oakland University there. Now, Sarah Van Hoosen Jones did the same thing. The problem was Matilda gave $2 million with her gift. Sarah didn't give any cash with the Van Hoosen farm. And so Michigan State used Meadowbrook Hall to build Oakland University, and the Van Hoosen farm was mostly sold off. Only the last small, little, tiny corner was actually is part of our museum. The other 92%, unfortunately, is not ours anymore. In 1978, the major fires came through Matilda's Oliver barns, and now one of them is still standing. It was a Health Enhancement Institute, and it's now the Shotwell Gustafson Pavilion on their campus. It's one of about 2 buildings left from this massive complex that was out there until 1978. Park Davis Biological Farm, once again, Park Davis was located in downtown Detroit. They did experiments and made serums. They had to use animals to do this and test everything. They didn't have places in downtown Detroit, so they had to find a place outside of Detroit where they could raise animals. So they bought 300 acres of land in Rochester in 1908. Because we had an interurban line that connected our town to downtown Detroit. So they raised all kinds of animals: horses, cattle, guinea pigs, rabbits, poultry, monkeys. Great stories about how they transferred monkeys. They had a flyman from India. They landed at Detroit Metro Airport. They would then be quarantined for about a week on the tarmac to make sure they didn't have any diseases, and then they would be transferred onto a truck, and then the truck would drive out to Rochester. There are numerous stories about times when the local residents would find monkeys in the trees. So obviously they did escape periodically. But there are things that happen there that to this day I just hold my breath and say, oh my gosh. They could only do smallpox vaccine, which was tested on cattle during the wintertime. The risk was if a fly, they did this in the summertime, and a fly bit one of those cattle that was being tested and being inoculated with smallpox, and then that fly flew in and started biting children and residents of Rochester, you'd have a smallpox epidemic, and suddenly you'd have quite an issue going on. And so things had to be timed by the weather. Horses were used mainly for diphtheria and lockjaw tetanus. because horse's blood and human blood were so similar. And so they could inoculate a horse. The horse's body then would fight off and create antibodies. Then they would bleed these horses down. That blood would be shipped to Detroit and made into serums for humans and be inoculated into humans. My favorite story that I've ever heard is the one that brings a tear to my eye every time I hear it. A man one time knocked on the door. He wanted to meet the horse that saved his life. And so they're like, what do you mean the horse that saved? Well, here's my vial, here's my pills, and I want to meet the horse that saved my life. He had had lockjaw, which is tetanus, and had been cured. The father with several kids at home, and he just wanted to say thank you to whoever did that. Well, the workers were all like stunned. It had never happened before. So they look at the vial, they look up the right numbers. Sure enough, the horse is still alive. No animal that ever went into Park Davis ever came out. They all had to be destroyed. And so the horse was still alive. They went out, they brought the horse in, and they stood there as the man went up and embraced the horse, and to thank that horse for saving his life. So it's a remarkable story. The buildings that are on the pictures here were the most stunningly beautiful barn buildings I've ever seen in my life. Today, our Older Person Center, our OPC they call it in Rochester, is located there. And so the buildings were torn down in about 1999, maybe 2000, and they were stunningly beautiful buildings. They did give us a chance to go inside and do some footage inside there. And they said the animals that were there were the best treated animals in the world. There was no dust, there was no vermin, they were the well fed, they were ventilated. There was beautiful buildings, and the animals were very well treated, but none of them ever left. And then the last thing I'd like to really talk about is what we do locally here, how it affects the world. I'm not a polio kid, that's a little bit before my time. Some of you, though, polio must have been terrifying. I don't know if you were kids then. I'm going to assume you were kids based on your ages here. But you probably didn't swim during the summertime because they thought it was waterborne. They weren't sure how it was being spread. And if I say anything wrong about polio, by all means let me know. But at some point they had to come up with a vaccine for polio. And I can't imagine as a parent how worried you must have been. And so imagine one day when Jonah Salk walks into your community and is doing experiments in your community to come up with a polio vaccine. And he's successful. Jonah Salk was working with the University of Michigan. They were doing experiments in Rochester. And they came up with this polio vaccine. So what do? Okay, so you finally have it. You think you got it. What do? At some point, you got to start administering the medicine. So who do you give it to? Well, you give it to the toughest people out there, kindergartners. And that's where it started. It started with kindergartners. And who did they give them to? Locally, they pick schools all over the country. And locally, Woodward School in the Rochester area, and it's not there anymore, so it's been torn down. Mary Eberline was a polio pioneer. You got a card. And I don't know if it was a sugar cube. I don't know if the vaccine was on a sugar cube, and you didn't know if you were getting the real thing or a placebo. But that's what happened. And so the polio vaccine was created and invented in Rochester, Michigan. So Blue Park ski jump. In the 1940s, we're getting a little bit closer finally to bring it up to present. In the 1930s, as a way of entertaining our community, we came up with a ski jump. We were blessed with these beautiful valleys, with these rivers that cut through our town. We also have these huge hills. And so the Detroit Red Wing Ski Club from Detroit, the Hall brothers, came out and they built this ski jump. In 1926, they built the first one. There's no way you would have caught me on that ski jump. Interestingly enough, though, the businesses on Main Street all sold jumping skis. I mean, we were the ski jumping capital of the Lower Peninsula. I mean, the Upper Peninsula had Ishpeming, Michigan. They still have their jumps up there. But in the Lower Peninsula, it all happened here in Rochester. Now, Brighton had a jump, and so there were some other communities around that had a jump. I'm not sure they were as high as ours or as active as ours, but Rochester certainly had a lot going on. They also had a club called the Rochester Boys. The Rochester Boys were a bunch of show-offs is what they were, and they would challenge anybody. So we would host international ski competitions. Finland, Norway, Sweden, all the Scandinavian countries, they would come to Rochester, Michigan for these ski jumps. So what happens in January of 1928, and you don't have any snow? That's happened before in our community. Remember, we have those winters where it doesn't snow as much? Well, at the bottom of the hill, coincidentally, there was a train track, the one that went to Bay City, and eventually it was completed all the way to Mackinac. So they would they'd take that car, empty boxcars, they went to Gaylord, loaded snow into the boxcars, brought them back to Rochester, hand shoveled them up onto the hill so they could have skiing competitions. And they said that the traffic would back up for a mile and for people to come. And of course, the Rochester boys would challenge all these guys. These were all amateur jumpers. Initially amateur jumpers. Eventually, a couple of them went on to quite a bit of success. But at one point in one of our competitions, they talk about how these Scandinavian jumpers were going to have two of them go side by side down the jump together and then soar off. And how, it's really sounds dangerous to me. And so they did that. Oh, and they said the crowd was just inspired by that. Until the Rochester boys announced that they would do 5. And they put 2 down the slide, 1 behind it, and then 2 more. And they were all on the slide at the same time. And they would just keep flying off. And they said the crowd was thrilled with the spectacle. Oh my gosh, it sounds awful. And the other thing that I find so fascinating is that in the 1930s, they said if you were coming down M24, coming through Lake Orion in Oxford, you could see the ski jump at Bloomer Park. And I had to say, and now the first time somebody told me that, I said, oh, there's no way, there's just no way. And they said, you have to understand, there were no trees. Remember the Sawmills? We were still growing up. Our trees were all coming back. And they said there were no trees in the way. The view was spectacular. The trees are all grown up now. See how they're ruining our views, all these trees? But they said you could see it, and it was an imposing sight. And so it blew down in 1934. They built it up again, and it was wrecked during World War II.
After World War II, it wasn't rebuilt. And we have, so I have some of the jumping skis in our archival collection. We even have moving footage of the guys jumping. Now, the Olympics are coming out. So in the next 3 weeks, if you're watching this competition, we'll watch this perfect form. The guys, their skis are positioned just right. They know how to lean. They do everything just right. In our moving videos, the guys, their arms are going like this the whole way, trying to catch their balance on the way up. It kind of looks like me trying to figure out how I'm going to do it. I end my program talking about resonance. And when we started our Hall of Fame in Rochester, I really based it on the fact that I felt like our whole community, I'm not just want to say students, it's all of us. So often we look for our inspiration from professional athletes, which always seem to be disappointing, ultimately in their lifestyles. And so we said, why don't we recognize the people who have done amazing things in our own community? So let's start looking at some of them. So that's what we try to do. Initially, I said my rule is that we have to have the same number of men as we do women. And it was never difficult in Rochester. We always had those successful men and women. So I was really proud of that. And so the first graduating class had 6 men and 6 women and a horse. The horse Tess is related back to the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company. Tess provided more pints of blood for the antitoxins. And during World War I, Tess was taken all over the country in every parade to try and build morale in the United States. So Tess is a horse that saved the farm, is what they call it. Tess has a very special burial place at Park Davis. That's what the newspaper article says. Nobody at Park Davis seems to know where that burial place is today. But nonetheless, Tess was buried with special honor. I really would like to find out where Tess is buried. Nonetheless, our second graduating class, the males took over again. So I don't know what to say. I was not on the committee. I took myself off, just so it would be really fair. The Van Hoosens are one family I talk about. I talk about Joshua Van Hoosen, and all he ever did was to try to promote farmers and to educate farmers. And if a reporter came into town, and he was the one taking them around, saying why Avon Township farmers were so great, and just trying to promote farming and education, and insisted that his daughters, who weren't even eligible to go to a college, he insisted that they would go to a high school. And sure enough, as the University of Michigan started allowing women to go, he allowed his daughters to go to college. Unheard of. One daughter became a school teacher, a very respectable career. The other daughter was the disgraced Bertha, who became a surgeon. And it's just this remarkable family. And then the 5th generation, his granddaughter, Sarah, who had once again, education was everything to this family. You see the value of education, right? And to this day, that's certainly something that has been a theme, I think, that has run through both the Troy and the Rochester community, is how important education is. So for all the things I read about education and all the attention that education commands in our newspapers, it's because we take it so seriously. Whether it's the local schools trying to pay their bills, it's been an issue for a long time because we take it so seriously. It's kind of a neat thing to have. Van Doren coverlets. Abraham William Van Doren was the most prolific coverlet weaver in Michigan's history. He lived in Stony Creek. When the Michigan State Fair started in the 1850s, he was the first one to ever win a blue ribbon on the first Michigan State Fair for his fancy coverlet weavings. These weavings would cover about a king-size bed. He used a weaving loom called a jacquard loom. And the jacquard loom needed a 12-foot ceiling. So in a room like this where we are in the Troy Museum, it might work here. If not, you just cut a hole in your ceiling. That was no problem. You just extended that up. The Greenville Village has one on display. But he would take these orders, and then he would use a pre-programmed card that was fed into the machine. Today we call that machine a computer, where you pre-program it for what you want it to do ahead of time. And so the jacquard weaving loom has a lot to do with computers today. And so he did this in the 1850s. Eventually went bankrupt because nobody could afford the $2. And we've been working, you know, for many years. We have about 17 in our collection. Our goal this year is to put them back on display. We haven't had them out for a long time. Sam Harris. Sam Harris was the only commissioned officer in the Civil War who was from Rochester, Michigan. My favorite stories of all time. He wrote a story called Why I Was Not Hung, the story of Sam Harris. Briefly, I'll tell you the story. We sell the book for $3 in our gift shop. It's the best $3 you can spend. Sam Harris was assigned to run a picket line and a bunch of gentlemen in Kentucky. And so he's down there, you know, riding along. He's in the cavalry unit. Sure enough, there's a log cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney. There's obviously somebody occupying it. The men, he orders to surround the building, storm in, kick the door down. They go in, and there's a mom and her 3 kids starving to death. And they are not doing well. Her husband's a Confederate soldier, and things aren't going well. They're not going to survive. And he said, listen, I'm not here to watch women and children die. So he orders his men to go get provisions and to bring them to the end of the war and to make sure this woman and her children are going to survive. And this woman is so taken by this kind Union officer that she writes to her college roommate. And she said, this guy, Sam Harris, is the nicest gentleman. If you would ever run across a situation where you could help Sam Harris from Rochester, Michigan, do everything you can. He saved our lives. Fast forward. Sam Harris eventually is part of Dahlgren's Raiders. Dahlgren's Raiders was a cavalry unit that stormed into downtown Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and stormed the Libby prison to try and free the Union soldiers that were there. Very daring. You're going right to the middle of the Confederacy, and he is wounded and captured. So the Confederates get there and they say, we've got a Union officer here. What a great way of setting an example to all other Union soldiers. We're going to hang him in a public square. And we're going to show what happens if you come into the Confederacy thinking that you're going to free soldiers in our downtown area. And so on the way to the gallows, and this is vividly documented in all of what happened there, he is on his way to the gallows, and the streets are lined with people. He's got a hood on, but the eye holes or somewhere were cut out so he could see out, and he could see people. And he was looking up into the windows, and the women would be, you know, crying. They'd be pulling their shade down because they didn't want to see this guy, you know, moments before he was going to die. At some point, they invite Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to come with his wife to watch the hanging. And this is going to be a spectacle to show the Union what was going to happen. So Jefferson Davis talks to his wife and says, hey, we're going to go to a hanging of Sam Harris of Rochester, Michigan. And his wife said, Sam Harris? You know what? He was very kind to my college roommate, and she orders her husband to spare his life. So all of a sudden now, this Rochester soldier has this connection to the president of the Confederacy. And he spares his life. At the gallows, spares his life. So Sam Harris is released, and he can't figure out why he's released. He's released, he moves back to Rochester, Michigan. He eventually moves to Chicago, has a very successful career in the plumbing business. But at some point, it's driving him crazy as to why he wasn't hung. So he wrote a book on why I was not hung. He went back to Richmond, and he traced the whole story back to figure out what happened. And in this book, for $3, he traces the whole thing and how it happened. That he had befriended the woman who was the college roommate of Jefferson Davis's wife. It's just a remarkable story. He eventually donated a drinking fountain to our community called the Harris Fountain. The Harris Fountain moved all over downtown Rochester. Every time there was a road improvement project, it had to be moved again. Then it was moved for about 12 years. I think it was in our local cemetery, Mount Avon Cemetery. It wasn't a tombstone, but it sure looked like a tombstone. It seemed like a good place. It was there for a long time until last summer. It was moved back to downtown Rochester next to our World War II monument, and it's flowing water again. So this is a fun story. So Sam Harris is a great guy. Madonna is from Rochester. Went to Rochester Adams High School. The most popular pop artist, you know, she's more than Michael Jackson, more than Elvis. No other commentary necessary. A few others, I'll just throw out names. Dorothy Beardmore was on the state school board for many years, was an educator in our area. Robert Kedzie came to Rochester in the 1830s, married a young lady from Rochester, and she died in childbirth. He was the vice principal of the Rochester Academy, so education is a very important part of his life. And was so distraught by his wife dying in childbirth that he went to the University of Michigan and enrolled in that school. He said, this isn't going to happen. Women aren't supposed to be dying in childbirth. And he was so distraught by the medical conditions, he became a doctor. During the Civil War, he was captured on the battlefield, taking care of both Union and Confederate soldiers, and was a prisoner of war. Eventually was released, and spent about a 30-year career as a chemist at the Michigan Agricultural College. Today we call that Michigan State University. 3 of his sons, I believe, became president of Michigan Agricultural College. Kelsey Hall is one of the largest chemistry building on campus. And he got a start in downtown Rochester. That's where his whole career started. started. And he was a community activist. He defended farmers, and he's just a remarkable story in Robert Kedzie. Helen Williams was a woman that taught literature in the Rochester area. She eventually worked for the United Nations as an expert on children's literature and traveled all over the world. And Matilda Wilson was involved with Meadowbrook Hall. Great philanthropist. So, the most famous residents that we have, well, it's always going to come down to you and me. You know, what are each of us going to do, you know, to make our community a little bit better? You know, how are we going to leave it a better place than we found it? It's kind of remarkable when we watch all these different events and all the things that spearheaded behind every event that I talked about, whether it was a fire or whether it was a new mill or a new business venture or a new school. There was somebody that stood up and said, hey, this is what we have to do. You know, in Troy, you're certainly going through that right now with the village. You know, so this is where the town has to rally and say, hey, what are we going to do? I mean, this is a decision voters get to make, and you know, it's been going on since 1819, right? Nancy is when Troy was. So since 1819, these tough decisions have been there, and you got another tough one. I don't want to editorialize which way you should go. I'm just saying that once again, all of our communities are faced, you know, with these decisions. The best leadership rises to the top, and they marshal us through. 5 years from now, we get a chance to put this little footnote in history as to how Troy responded to the current situation. So it's kind of interesting how each of us will respond. And it's always fun when I watch the presidential elections. I always try and take a contemporary event and talk about what it'll be like. For instance, a lot of people, you know, as Barack Obama became our new president to replace George Bush, you know, a lot of people always talk about George Bush and what his legacy will be and how he'll be regarded as a president. And the answer is, we don't know. 50 years from now, it'll be interesting how they reflect back onto it. You know, the things that they said about Franklin D. Roosevelt, the hatred of Abraham Lincoln. You know, if you ever followed his career, and go to his presidential museum, and you'll see how despised he was as a leader. And yet, we look at Abraham Lincoln, and vastly, you know, usually he's ranked as one of the top 5 U.S. presidents. That wasn't the way it was contemporary when he was there, and shortly until after his death. And it's the same way. You know, a lot of what happens won't be judged for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see how all these issues where we're involved in the Middle East and how we react to things. And 50 years from now, that's when we'll finally find out how the presidencies of our last 2 presidents really were. And so that's where it's fun to look back on history and see how it will all go. At the Rochester Mills Museum, my last slide, we try to do a variety of different events too. We do vintage baseball and various festivals and events. I passed out my newsletter to you today. You're welcome to take those. I'll leave some extra copies here. And just know, and probably one of the things I'm most proud about is how closely the Troy Museum, the Rochester Hills Museum, the Birmingham Museum, how often we talk. And you know, sometimes we can't always find the best way of collaborating, but we're on the lookout for stuff. And so if I saw something that had something to do with the city of Troy, and it's part of your history, you know, Lorraine would be my very first phone call to make sure that history was being saved. And we're loyal to our communities. We're also loyal to the region. And we realize what happened in Southeast Michigan and what happened in the Midwest of the United States affected all of us. And so we're really trying to watch that. And I think both of our communities are pretty lucky. You know, these facilities that we have, like the Troy Historical Museum and the Rochester Hills Museum, these kind of places don't exist everywhere in the state of Michigan, nor everywhere in the Midwest. We are really lucky. It's one of those things that we don't want anybody to take it for granted. I met a couple of your volunteers that have worked here in the blacksmith shop, you know, in various places who've been volunteers here for 17 years. And all I can do is say thank you, because that's a huge, huge commitment and dedication back to a museum. So thanks for coming tonight. I appreciate it.